Alright, picture this. A father of 8 from Portlaoise disappears into thin air. A tip comes in claiming he's buried in a graveyard. The guards dig the place up, and absolutely nothing turns up. Then another theory pops up, and another, and every single one collapses like a wet cardboard box in the Irish rain. Meanwhile, his family, who have been living in what they call a living hell for years, are now watching the case explode back into the news because fresh arrests were made. And then everyone was released without charge. Again. So here we are, a missing man, conflicting stories, a gravesite that promised answers but delivered shadows, and a community where someone still knows the truth but hasn't come forward. This is the William Delaney case, and the deeper you go, the more it feels like the ground itself is hiding something. Portlaoise, County Lowas, a town that looks calm on the outside, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and news travels faster than the buses. But back in early 2019, something slipped into the cracks of that quiet routine, something that still hasn't crawled back out. William Delaney wasn't a mysterious stranger drifting through life. He was a father of 8, a familiar face around town, someone who had connections, neighbors, stories, problems, hopes, all the normal pieces of a normal Irish life. And then suddenly he was gone. No dramatic farewell, no clear trail, no handy CCTV clip that solves the whole thing in a neat montage, just absence. The last confirmed time anyone saw him was around the Portlaoise area, and from that moment on, the case twisted itself into knots. Rumors spread, whispers shifted from pub corners to social media, and the community felt the tension because disappearances don't sit quietly in a place like this. And hovering over it all were the guards, trying to piece together a puzzle made out of fog. Interviews, appeals, statements that didn't quite match. Portlaoise started feeling less like a town and more like the opening chapter of a detective novel where you know the author is about to be cruel. And at the center of it all, William's family waiting for answers that never seemed to land. At first, people hoped it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe William had gone off to clear his head. Maybe he was staying with someone. Maybe there was some explanation waiting to walk through the door. But very quickly, the gaps in the story started to feel less like gaps and more like warning signs. For one, William's usual routines just stopped. No check-ins with family, no everyday habits, no trace of movement. A father of 8 doesn't just vanish without leaving ripples. And yet the water around his life went still, too still. Then came the whisper networks. You know the type. Someone heard something from someone who knew someone. And suddenly theories were flying around town faster than the guards could keep track of them. Conflicting claims popped up. Stories didn't line up. People who should have been sure weren't. The biggest early red flag? Nobody could agree on what supposedly happened to William. You'd expect in a real disappearance that the truth would at least hint at itself. But here, it felt like everyone was pointing in different directions with the confidence of a bad weather forecast. And then came the first big tip, the one that would drag investigators straight to a graveyard, a supposed burial site. A claim that sounded dramatic, urgent, and finally like the breakthrough everyone needed. But underneath that tip, there was something off. The timing, the source, the strange details. It all felt shaky, but desperate families cling to anything that looks like hope, and the guards had to follow through. This was the moment the case stopped being a disappearance and started being something darker. So let's walk through this whole thing the way the guards tried to, step by step, like following footprints in mud that someone keeps trying to sweep away. In early 2019, William Delaney is last confirmed to have been seen in the Portlaoise area. After that moment, his trail just snaps. No phone activity, no bank movement, no sightings that held up under questioning. It was like someone took an eraser to the final chapter of his story. Not long after the disappearance, the first major tip lands. Someone claims William was buried in a graveyard in County Lowas. Not just somewhere out there, a specific gravesite. A detail that would make anyone stop and listen. The kind of tip that sounds too precise to ignore. The guards launch an official search of the site, machinery, forensic specialists, the whole operation. For days, locals watched a burial ground being turned into a potential crime scene, and then nothing, no human remains, No sign of William, just dirt and disappointment. More time passes, more theories bubble up. Some contradict the last tip, some contradict each other, and some contradict basic reality. That's when investigators start noticing a pattern. Every time they get close to clarity, the story shifts again. Fast forward to recent weeks, and the timeline takes another twist. 3 people are arrested in connection with the case, a huge moment. Finally, after years of fog, a possible breakthrough. But after questioning, all 3 are released without charge. That leaves William's family stuck between hope and heartbreak, again. So this is the timeline. A disappearance with no anchor. A graveside dig with no result. Arrests with no charges. And a case that keeps looping back into mystery, refusing to settle. It's the kind of timeline that doesn't just raise questions, it shouts them. Every cold case has that one moment, that point where the whole investigation suddenly feels like it might flip on its head. In William Delaney's story, that moment came with the gravesite tip, because up until then, the case felt like a disappearance. Sad, confusing, tragic, but still a disappearance. But when someone confidently told the guards that William was buried in a specific grave in County Lowe, that changed the tone instantly. Now you're not just looking for a missing man, you're looking for remains. You're looking for answers buried under soil. And when the family hears that level of detail, hope and dread start wrestling inside the same heart. The search was intense. Heavy machinery rolled into the cemetery. Specialists combed through earth that had held generations of stories. Reporters showed up. Locals gathered in that awkward, fearful silence small towns get when something dark rises to the surface. Everyone braced themselves for the truth. And then, nothing. Not a trace of William. Not a single piece of evidence that the tip was ever real. But the emotional damage? That part was very real. The family later described this moment as one of the cruelest blows because it dangled closure in front of them, then ripped it away again. Then came the second turning point, years later, the 3 arrests. For a brief moment, the entire case surged with energy. People whispered that this might finally be it, that justice could be coming, that someone had finally cracked. But when all 3 were released without charge, the energy collapsed back into uncertainty. Another spike of hope followed by another fall into confusion. These 2 events, a grave that held no truth and arrests that led nowhere, became the emotional heartbeat of the case. Every time the investigation seems like it's about to break open, it snaps shut again. And with each false dawn, the weight on William's family grows heavier. If there's one thing the guards are certain of in this case, it's that uncertainty is doing laps around them. But to be fair, they've pushed through every lead, even the ones that looked like they were stitched together with pure nonsense. From the moment William Delaney vanished, investigators started the standard checklist. Interviews, door-to-door inquiries, checking known addresses, tracing movements, talking to anyone who might have seen or heard something. And early on, they realized something important. Too many stories did not match. People remembered things differently. Timelines were fuzzy. Statements contradicted each other like they were competing in a talent show. Then came the gravesite tip. The big swing. The guards treated it as seriously as you'd expect. They brought in forensic specialists, ground-penetrating work, and a careful excavation of the identified area. This wasn't a quick look around. It was a methodical, professional, emotionally heavy operation. And when it turned up nothing, they didn't shrug it off. They went back to re-interviewing, cross-checking, recalculating the timeline. They then followed up on alternative theories, movements in the days before the disappearance, associates, vehicles, locations William was supposedly taken to, and the stories that kept changing with each new week. And here's the frustrating part. None of these threads tied cleanly into anything solid. Fast forward to the recent arrests, 3 individuals brought in for questioning. This wasn't random. It was based on information, statements, and patterns investigators believed were significant. The guards spent hours gathering accounts, comparing testimonies, checking evidence, but after all that, whatever they had was not strong enough to bring charges. All 3 people walked out the front door again. So the investigation sits in this strange limbo. Plenty of information, but not enough proof. Plenty of talk, but not enough clarity. Plenty of theories, but none that rise above speculation. And yet, the guards still believe the same thing they believed on day 1. Someone out there knows the truth. Someone has a piece of this puzzle and for whatever reason hasn't given it up. That's why the appeals keep coming. That's why the case keeps resurfacing. Because the investigation isn't cold, it's stuck between people who might talk and people who won't. Now, before we dip into this section, here's the golden rule. We only deal with verified information and publicly reported theories. No guessing, no naming uncharged individuals, no wild accusations. We keep it clean, factual, and YouTube friendly. So, what are the known theories in the disappearance and suspected murder of William Delaney? The first major theory came from that infamous gravesite tip, the one that led investigators to a cemetery in County Loa. The suggestion was simple and chilling, that William had been harmed and quietly buried. It carried enough detail to sound credible and enough urgency to pull the guards straight into the dirt. But when the search found nothing, the theory didn't die. It just cracked. The question shifted from "is he buried here?" to "why did someone say he was?" Another theory revolves around conflicting accounts from people who interacted with William around the time he vanished. Media reports have highlighted how statements and timelines didn't line up cleanly. Some claims contradicted others, leaving investigators with several versions of the same days. Those contradictions fueled the belief that not everyone was being fully honest, whether intentionally or not. Then, more recently, the 3 arrests reignited speculation. The arrests themselves were based on information the guards clearly considered significant. But because all 3 individuals were released without charge, the public does not know the specifics. This means there are no official suspects that the public can point to. The arrests simply indicate that investigators had leads strong enough to pursue, but not strong enough to sustain. And finally, there's the theory the guards themselves emphasize. Someone in the community is holding back key information. Whether out of fear, loyalty, guilt, or pressure, nobody knows. But investigators have repeatedly said they believe the truth is close, too close to ignore. So the theories in this case sit in that frustrating gray zone. Not proven, not dismissed, but hovering. And until someone steps forward with the missing piece, the story remains trapped between possibility and silence. If you look at the William Delaney case from a distance, it feels like a story made of almost breakthroughs. Over and over, investigators get close enough to taste progress. And then the trail snaps again like someone cutting a thread. The first huge swing, the gravesite excavation, should have been the moment everything changed. A specific location, a confident tip, forensic teams ready to uncover whatever lay beneath. But when the ground gave back nothing, the investigation didn't just stall. It recoiled. That kind of false lead doesn't just waste time, it drains trust, energy, and morale. Suddenly every future tip had to be weighed against the memory of that empty grave. Years pass, appeals come and go, the family keeps pushing, the community keeps wondering, and the guards, they keep circling the same core belief: someone knows more than they're saying. Then, finally, a new spark. Within the last stretch of months, 3 people are arrested in connection with the case. For a brief moment, this looked like the turning point everyone had spent years waiting for. Media vans started rolling again. The family braced themselves. Portlaoise started paying closer attention. But just as quickly as it came, the moment dissolved. All 3 were released without charge. No breakthrough, no answers. Just another cycle of hope stretching itself into disappointment. And that's the real stagnation here. Not lack of effort, not lack of will, but lack of verifiable evidence. Investigators have information, theories, statements, and years of context, but none of it locks into place hard enough to move the case forward. That's why the latest developments, the renewed media spotlight, the public appeal this week, the pleas from the Delaney family feel so heavy. Because after so long, the case isn't cold, it's unfinished, suspended, stuck between what people know and what they're willing to say. And every time the case returns to headlines, you can feel the same message underneath it. This didn't stall because of lack of investigation. It stalled because someone out there still hasn't come forward. For William Delaney's family, this isn't just a case. It's not just headlines, theories, searches, or police appeals. It's life, reshaped, hollowed out, and stretched across years of uncertainty. They described it themselves as a living hell. And honestly, that might be the most accurate phrase anyone has spoken about this entire ordeal. Imagine waking up every day with no answers, no closure, no place to grieve, No truth to hold on to. Just the same heavy question sitting at the end of every thought. What actually happened to William? The community in Portlaoise hasn't forgotten either. People who knew him, neighbors, friends, people who crossed paths with him regularly, still carry this weird, uneasy recognition that someone from their own world simply vanished, and that somewhere, buried under layers of silence or fear or loyalty, someone out there has the missing pieces. Every new headline drags the pain back into focus. Every fresh appeal from the guards reminds locals that the case is still unresolved. And every tip, even the ones that go nowhere, forces the family to ride another emotional roller coaster they never asked to get on. What's especially heartbreaking is that William's children have grown up in the shadow of this mystery. Years have passed, lives have changed, but the absence is still loud, still confusing, still impossible to make peace with. On the investigative side, the guards continue to insist that the answers are close. Their appeals this week weren't just procedural, they were emotional, targeted, and clearly aimed at someone specific, someone who has stayed quiet for too long. And so the aftermath isn't really after. It's ongoing. A wound that hasn't closed, a story that hasn't ended, a family waiting for a truth that refuses to surface. In the end, the William Delaney case feels like one long echo. A man disappears, and every lead that should bring clarity just scatters into more questions. A graveside tip that turned out to be nothing. Arrests that flickered with promise and then faded. A community that whispers, and a family, 8 children, a mother, siblings, all stuck living with a silence that never lets them breathe. Someone out there knows what happened. Someone has the missing piece. And until they speak, this case will keep resurfacing, pulling everyone back into the same unanswered question. How does a man vanish and stay vanished in a place where everyone knows everyone? Maybe the truth is closer than we think. Maybe the right voice just hasn't been heard yet. But whatever the answer is, it's time for it to come out of the dark. If you want fast updates on Irish true crime, subscribe. We cover everything before it hits mainstream headlines.